Billy Lane from Choppers Inc. And I want to talk to you about choppers today because I've been riding choppers since day one. I tell you I was riding choppers since before they were cool, but choppers were always cool. Choppers have been cool since the movie Easy Rider came out, and probably before. But today I want to talk to you about 3 really important choppers in my book, and that's the bikes I build: the Choppers Inc. chopper, the Jesse James West Coast chopper, and the Indian Larry choppers from New York City. Now, I've been riding and building choppers since the late 1980s. So was Jesse, so was Larry. But all 3 of us really came on in the mid to late 1990s and became really well known. And our styles evolved really differently. Jesse was from Long Beach, California. Larry was in New York City, and I was in Florida. So our 3 styles developed a lot differently. And I want to go over the differences between the styles of the Indian Larry bike, the West Coast chopper, and the Billy Lane Choppers Inc. bike. First, let's talk about the frames each of us use because that dictates a lot of the style of each of our choppers. All right, starting with the Indian Larry chopper. Indian Larry used Palco rigid frames. And I know he's really known for the twisted down tube, but before he was doing the twisted down tube on those frames, he was using a standard Palco frame. And he liked them with 2 inches of stretch and 30 to 33 degrees rake. And that 2 inches of stretch I'm talking about is right here in these down tubes. They would add 2 inches to this tube and raise the neck up from the ground 2 inches. The rake is the angle that the neck makes with the vertical, which is 30 degrees. Now, the Palco rigid frame is basically a copy of a Harley-Davidson rigid frame, so there is really not a whole lot of stretch into it. The dimensions are basically the same as a Harley-Davidson frame that was used on a knucklehead or a panhead all the way from 1936 to 1957. The West Coast chopper CFL 2-Up was a little bit different of an animal. Jesse didn't really copy the Harley-Davidson frame like Palco did. He was making his own frames and he took a few liberties with them. The CFL frame has a raised rear axle plate which lowers the ride height of the bike. So that axle, I think, is dropped 1.25 inches from where the Harley-Davidson frame or the Palco frame that Indian Larry used was. Also, Jesse added distance between the rear axle and the seat post. Then Jesse's 2-Up frame also had 2 inches of stretch here in the down tubes and had stretch in the backbone. And Jesse was using 38-degree rake on his frames, whereas Larry was using 30 degrees. The Choppers Inc., I was kind of all over the place with the rake and stretch of the frames, but my favorite is what I used on blue. It was built in the late 1990s. This frame has 2 inches of stretch in the rear, also has a raised axle like the West Coast chopper CFL, but has 4 inches of stretch in the front and 45 degrees rake. Substantially more rake than what Larry was using, and quite a bit more than what Jesse was using on the CFL. This axle plate was raised 1.5 inches to lower the ride height by 1.5 inches. It was 2 inches of stretch between the rear axle and the seat post, just like the West Coast chopper CFL. Then I had 4 inches of stretch here in the down tube, 4 inches of stretch in the backbone, and then 45-degree rake, which allowed me to use that 12-inch over springer. Indian Larry always used a basic flat fender to fit really tightly to the rear wheel. And Larry would always make funky sissy bars on his bike to support the rear fender. It's exemplary of what he would have done. He always ran a 21-inch wheel up front with no front fender. Jesse was in the fender business, so he used his fenders on all of his builds. And here's a West Coast chopper's radius rear fender. You see how nicely it fits that tire. This is one of the things that Jesse mastered, was getting these fenders to fit the tire right. A lot of people mess up with this. He never did. This fender is called a 2-ton hoe with a web strut. This CFL has the web strut. Sometimes Jesse wouldn't use the web strut. Sometimes he would build a reinforcement under the fender, so you wouldn't have anything back here at all supporting the rear of the fender. The strut would go all the way on the inside and be supported here on either side of the frame. And this front fender, again, is a radius fender that fits the tire really well, 21-inch front tire, and it's called a Diablo fender. The rear fender on blue is also a West Coast Choppers fender that I widened. Jesse wasn't making them this wide. I'm running a 240 millimeter rear tire on this, but I cut the fender and welded it to the frame. And this is something I learned from Ron Finch. Ron Finch always used steel rod work on his bikes. And I robbed this idea from him and welded it to my rear fender, had my painter mold it in. All this sheet metal body work under here is a Miami thing. This is what was happening in Miami in the late 80s and early 90s with the customs. Everything was being molded and really, really smooth. I'm kind of well known for my sissy bars, so a lot of my bikes had a custom sissy bar on them. when I was building blue, I didn't want that. I was kind of going for that West Coast style a little bit with this bike. So I decided not to use a sissy bar on this, even though most of my builds at the time had them. I also love a 21-inch front wheel, like the other two builders, and I never like a front fender at all. Even though some of the custom bikes that Larry built had the front brakes on them, some of the ones you might know from the Discovery Channel, the pure Indian Larry choppers didn't have a front brake. He didn't feel the need for it. He didn't like the weight of it. Jesse always ran a front brake. He would usually run a Performance Machine or a Brembo disc. Similar to Larry, I didn't like a front brake either. I'd always run a really tiny spool front hub with no provision for a brake. Larry's running a Performance Machine 4-piston rear brake caliper with one of his signature question mark brake rotors. His typical earlier bikes would have a Russell brake rotor on it. Jesse's running a full floating rotor on his with a Brembo 4-piston caliper. Because I was always a flathead, pinhead, and knucklehead guy, they had a mechanical drum rear brake, and the brake and the sprocket would be on the left side, which would leave you nothing on the right-hand side of the hub. So I always liked using a left side brake. I developed an inboard brake that Performance Machine later would copy. But before I did that, I got this perimeter brake rotor from Braking. It was one of their prototypes. And I designed this brake system. Everything's welded to the rim using a set of Performance Machine 2-piston calipers. But if a Choppers Inc. bike didn't have this, it would have an inboard brake system on it. And one of the products I'm real well known for is this 3-bar spinner I was making. And I was making these because the hub seemed so plain on the right side of the bike. And I was always a hot rod guy. And I liked the Hala brand knockoff wheel. So I made my own version of a knockoff spinner for the right side of my wheels. When it came to fuel tanks, Larry was pretty basic. He liked a Ponco peanut tank with a screw and bayonet cap on his bikes. Jesse became really well known for his villain tanks, but he used a lot of Sportster tanks and Sportster shaped tanks. A lot of the handmade tanks Jesse would make were versions of the Harley-Davidson Sportster tank, including the villain tank, which was an exaggerated version of the Harley-Davidson Sportster tank. My gas tanks are all over the map. I handmade most of them. This tank that I have in blue was a mini Paco teardrop tank, similar to what Larry was using. I would use the front half of it and then graft a steel tail to it. It would give it this long, exaggerated teardrop shape. Larry loved panheads and shovel heads. Most of his customs were built with panheads and shovel heads. This one's a 1950 FL 1200cc panhead engine. Larry loved S&S carburetors. That's what he used on all his choppers. Jesse was pretty much an Evo guy, typically using around 100 to 113 inches during the golden era of the West Coast chopper. Jesse was using the big inch Nigel Patrick and S&S Evo engines, usually polished billet aluminum. Beautiful. Jesse loved the S&S Super E Shorty with one of his West Coast choppers air cleaners. Like Larry, I like the vintage Harley-Davidson engine. Big flat head, knucklehead, panhead, shovel head. I used some Evos, but most of what I was building back in the old days and even to this day is done with vintage Harley-Davidson engines. I love them. They never make it to the junkyard. This bike originally had an SU carburetor on it, which is British. It came off of cars like Jaguars and MGs. My dad was an MG guy when I was a kid, so I really liked SUs, and I had one on it and it ran really, really good. Larry told me a long time ago that SU was the first 2 letters in suck. Now I'm running an S&S Super E Shorty on it like the other 2 guys. For more on the different types of Harley-Davidson V-twin engines custom builders use, click the link below and watch my video, The History of the Harley-Davidson V-twin engine. When it comes to exhaust, Larry loves shotgun pipes. These are drag pipes. He usually used one of the two, either a set of shotgun pipes or a set of drag pipes. He never really tried too much else. He loved that a bike would be asymmetric. Besides being in the fender business, Jesse was in the exhaust business, and he got really well known for his Hellbent pipes. And pretty much all of his bikes would have these or his FU pipes, which came out a few years later. Like with my gas tanks, I was always different with my exhaust. I didn't do the same thing twice very much. I like the symmetry of a bike, different than Larry's taste. So I have one out each side, even though they're not symmetric. It gives some balance to the bike. My rear exhaust comes out the right-hand side of the bike underneath the transmission, and the left pipe comes around over the primary and down underneath the gearbox on the left-hand side. Larry's pipes are the only pipes that make sense. Mine and Jesse's are two different lengths. This front pipe is way longer than the other pipe. With a Harley-Davidson shovel head, which isn't really efficient, it doesn't really matter that much. Indy and Larry love the Harley-Davidson 4-speed with a Kickstarter and no electric start. On a couple of the bikes y'all know he was using Baker gearboxes, but he really, really loved the Harley-Davidson 4-speed with Kickstart. That was his thing. Because of the pipes Jesse was using, you couldn't run a Kickstarter on his bikes, and most of the engines were a huge cubic inch anyway. They've been hard to kickstart. So Jesse was using the modern Harley-Davidson 5-speed or Baker 5 and 6-speed that came out in the early 1990s. Seldom will you see Kickstart on a West Coast chopper. I use a little bit of everything. This is a 5-speed with a Kickstarter on it. I love having a Kickstart. Some of my bikes were electric start, some weren't. I really don't prefer electric start. I like to open belt drive with a Kickstarter. That's my preference when it comes to a chopper. Larry loved the foot clutch, and he loved the suicide shift with a real short lever right off the gearbox down by the oil tank. Larry liked really narrow forward controls on his bike. He liked them narrow because he liked to split lanes in traffic, especially in New York City and in Brooklyn. So he always used a really narrow forward control. Jesse was notorious for using a hydraulic Brembo clutch on the handlebar control and a standard 1 down, 4 up, or 1 down, 5 up foot shift. Jesse's CFLs had mid controls on them. These are shop built CFL foot controls with a Brembo master cylinder for the Brembo rear brake. Like Larry, I've always been a forward control guy, never really favored mid controls, so all my bikes would have forward controls, most of them custom made. This one has a Performance Machine master cylinder to match up with the 2 Performance Machine dual piston calipers I have running the back rotor. Like Larry, I was really into suicide shift and jockey shift with a foot clutch. Blue has a fairly short suicide shifter down near the gearbox over top of the belt drive, but I was really heavily influenced by Ed Roth. A lot of my bikes have a jockey shift with a long handle. It's almost like a cartoon handle that was way high above the bike, right up above the gas tank here. You can reach up and grab it like the Ed Roth t-shirts I grew up looking at in the 70s and 80s. Larry preferred an extended 35mm Harley-Davidson Narrow Glide because they were light and handled real well for the type of riding he was doing. Oftentimes he used a Seriani fork instead of a Harley-Davidson fork. Larry liked narrow mini ape hangers because the ape hangers allowed him to get his hands up above the mirrors of the cars he would be going between when he was split lanes in the city, riding in New York City and Brooklyn traffic. Jesse favored the 41mm telescopic wide glide fork for his bikes, and he would use either a small ape hanger handlebar or a Speedway style drag bar on his bikes. Those are pretty much the 2 styles that he would use. I've used a few telescopic hydraulic forks, but I really love springers. Most of the choppers that you know me for have an extended Harley-Davidson or Palco springer on them, or a springer from Mondo's Denver choppers in Nevada. This one's a 12-inch over Palco springer. I always use low, wider handlebars on my bikes. With the rake I use, you need a little bit of a wider handlebar to handle the weight of the fork when you're going slow. So a wider handlebar gives you that kind of leverage. We had a lot of problems with law enforcement in Florida pulling us over for using high handlebars because it's illegal in most states to have your handlebar grip 15 inches above the seat. After getting pulled over so many times for it, I quit riding with ape hangers and started using lower handlebars, specifically drag bars, and I started making my own. Larry and Jesse both typically used a potato chip shaped seat pan on their bikes. The shape is a little bit different between Larry's and Jesse's. You can see from the side it flips up in the back like a potato chip. It doesn't actually fit the frame in the fender. Likewise with Jesse's seat, potato chip pan, very thin, very basic. My style of seat was really, really different. I like the solo seat. It would sit right down on the frame. and fill the gap between the frame and the rear fender. Give you a lot more kick up in the rear, give you a lot more lumbar support. Talk about seats for a second. When you're thinking about rider comfort, don't think about cushion. Cushion doesn't matter that much in a motorcycle seat when it comes to riding miles. Lumbar support does. How your back and your posture is what's most important. And the reason I didn't use a seat like Jesse would use or like Larry would use is because I felt like they didn't give you enough lumbar support and posture control. I always made my seats a lot deeper with a lot more arch in them and made it a lot easier to ride these bikes all day, long distance. Larry liked aluminum Acron and Sun rims, 16 or 18 in the rear and 21 in the front. Usually 40 spokes was all he wanted on his bikes. He didn't go really elaborate with his wheels, pretty basic. Really great traditional chopper look to what he was doing with those wheels. Jesse's CFLs usually had 180 or 200 inch, 18 inch diameter rear wheels. Almost always a billet mag wheel versus spokes. He used spokes sometimes, but not too much. And a billet 21 inch wheel up front. One thing that the three of us agreed on was 21 inch front wheels the whole way. Since I was in the wide wire wheel business early on, this was one of my Choppers Inc. 18 by 8 80 spoke rear wheels on it. Deep dish offset to one side. And as mentioned earlier, a small spool 21 inch front wheel with 40 spokes. I never understood putting 80 spokes on the front when you're not handling any braking, torque, or horsepower torque up there. So I just used 40 spokes. So there's a pretty quick look in comparison between the Indian Larry, West Coast Chopper, and Choppers Inc. choppers from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s. I'd just like to point out that the West Coast Chopper is a Long Beach built West Coast chopper. Blue was built in my shop in the 1990s by me. And Indian Larry only built 8 custom bikes. A lot of people don't know that. But Indian Larry only built 8 custom bikes. This is actually an Indian Larry Legacy custom built in the Brooklyn shop shortly after Larry died in 2004. The Indian Larry bike doesn't have a battery, it has a magneto ignition. So when you kick the engine over, the magneto spins, and that's what creates the electrical current that creates the spark. They go to your spark plugs to fire the engine. So you don't have to turn the key on. You just turn the gas on, pull the enrichener up, give it a couple squirts. Because of the electric start, the West Coast Chopper CFL starts much easier than the other two. Blue's cold. To start blue, you got to give it a couple primer kicks with the enrichener on, then turn the key on and give it a couple more, and then she's always a little slow starting with this big cam I have in it. Comments after riding all 3 of these choppers. All 3 of them ride really different. I'd say the best handling bike out of the 3 has got to be the Indian Larry bike. It's definitely the lightest. It feels the most nimble. The suspension is really great on it. I think the weight of this bike is one of the things that makes it handle so well. Blue, because of the long rake, suicide shift and no front brake, is a lot of work to ride around town. I've been riding it for years every day as a daily commuter, so I'm very comfortable riding it. Most people get on it and are just freaked out by it. They don't even know what to think. They get off and they're like, no. The West Coast chopper does handle really well, but it's got the hellbent pipes on it, and hard right turns are really difficult with the hellbent pipes because the tips want to scrape the ground, and it's pretty unnerving. As far as braking goes, hands down, the West Coast chopper is the best. It's the heaviest of the three bikes, but it also has the front and rear Brembos. They stop really well. In second place for braking is going to be Blue. Blue's got the big perimeter brake on the back wheel, and that thing really stops well. The Indian Larry bike does stop well, but not quite as well as Blue. For highway riding, Blue is by far the best bike of the three. The long wheelbase really makes it go down the highway straight and through nice sweeping turns really, really smoothly and comfortably. Second best for highway cruising would be the Indian Larry bike. Third for highway riding would be the West Coast Chopper's bike, and I only say that because it has the mid controls, and the mid controls just aren't as comfortable for long distance riding as the forward controls are. You have your feet up so high, your knees are up so high compared to your abdomen that it really makes you roll your back over. So for long distance riding, it's going to be in third place. As far as power goes, the West Coast Chopper hands down takes the trophy there. It's got the big cubic inch Evo, just outclasses these two vintage Harley-Davidson engines, and the 6-speed gearbox with the modern clutch is just a much better bike to ride. It's probably the most fun bike to ride out of the three by far. Gets a lot of looks, has the best sound. Those hellbent pipes make a sound with that big inch Evo that you just can't beat. Comfort-wise, my choice is going to be Blue just because of the way the seat is designed. I think the seat gives you a lot better support than the potato chip pans. But if you're going to ride all day, the seat on Blue is going to be the most comfortable of the three. And it's hard to pick a favorite between these three bikes because I love my style. I love the rake and stretch of Blue going down the road. I think it has an amazing look. I've always loved Indian Larry's style. I mean, this is basically a David Mann bike. I mean, Larry's creations were straight off the page of an Easy Rider David Mann painting. And it's so traditional and the style of it is great. And when Jesse's West Coast Chopper style came on, instantly my eye saw that and knew it was pure perfection, and I love it. So it's very hard to pick a favorite between these three. I'd love for you to leave a comment below. Tell me what you think, which one you like, what you think about my comparisons, because this is probably not the end of this conversation.